My name is George Cunningham. I came to Seattle in August of 1961 looking at a job as a virologist in the then Department of Preventive Medicine. I was just finishing up my PhD at the University of Minnesota. Minnesota was at that time very well regarded for viruses, so I was hired essentially as a virologist. And I got the job, and then I came to Seattle in October, and we began to engineer a laboratory which was already in place. I was the first of the laboratory people, and as things turned out, that when I came here, they were working on the chlamydia. Well, chlamydia trachomatis causes disease in Africa and in the Orient. There's maybe 3 cases a year in the United States. So I was sort of baffled by that approach. And as we'll see, that turns out to be really quite interesting over time. In 1962, my subspecialty came to mind. I worked with Mycoplasma, Minnesota, which are small organisms. They're the smallest organisms known, and they infested tissue cultures. Well, that fall it was discovered that the eaten agent, a controversial agent of primary typical pneumonia, which was known since the 1940s, was in fact a mycoplasma. And so we set forth to look at the role of mycoplasma pneumonia in respiratory disease. Russ Alexander was involved in this, Tom Grayson was involved, and this project got funding. This was the era with the NIH. None of you recall this, but this was the era of, while you're up, get me a grant. People would call you up and say, we've got all this money to spend, can you do it? We were good at that. So anyhow, respiratory diseases became important. In about 1965, we began construction of the F-wing, and John Fox joined us. John Fox was a famous epidemiologist from New York, and he brought a large study of respiratory viruses. So the 1960s were the era of respiratory viruses. The rhinoviruses were discovered here, at that time period, and parainfluenza viruses. So there was tremendous enthusiasm over studying respiratory diseases, and we had the great advantage that we worked with group health, so we could actually study disease in a normal, non-hospitalized population. So this went on amazingly well through the 1960s. The virology part of preventive medicine got larger and larger. We had very large laboratory forces, and things looked great. In 1970, it became clear that the Department of Preventive Medicine was really getting very much larger and getting split up into pieces. So to backtrack a little bit, in 1968 we divided the department up into various divisions, and the laboratory division, which I was head of, was the Division of Experimental Laboratories. In 1970, because of the possibility of getting more federal funding if we were School of Public Health, we became a School of Public Health and split into 5 departments, of which pathobiology was the successor to the Division of Experimental Laboratories. So that gets us up to 1970 and learning how to be a School of Public Health. This was a fair endeavor because we had to build things that were quite different from preventive medicine, and and we moved on into other areas. As time went by in the 1970s, this great respiratory disease research institute we had began to slow down. Money got harder to get. There was less interest in respiratory diseases, and so this enterprise slowly wound down. But to replace it in the 1970s, the chlamydia people were looking at non-gonococcal urethritis, and they discovered that the chlamydia had a role in non-gonococcal urethritis, and that they had a big role. this had an explosive impact on the Seattle enterprise in sexually transmitted diseases. So there were major efforts went on through the 70s and into the 80s to look at the role of chlamydia in non-gonococcal arthritis. This was a big breakthrough, and it's sort of interesting that it should have come out of something which I thought at the beginning really was sort of strange for this department to be working on a disease that had little impact, no impact in the state of Washington, and there were a few cases in Arizona of trachoma. And we'll be seeing that there's even yet more to be discovered by this group. So in 1971-72, pathobiology launched its beginning of a graduate program. We had one master's student, one PhD student at first, and we built from there. So through the 70s and 80s, the PhD program was under construction. And we had filed a proposal for the PhD program with the graduate school in 1980. Well, then came the financial crisis of 1983, and the school decided not to put it forwards because of what effect it might have in the legislature, and so it was on hold. But in the meantime, the university had a special individual PhD program. Since there was no program like ours on campus, and since there was a conglomerate composed of biochemistry, microbiology, immunology, public health, epidemiology, we qualified for the special individual PhD program, and we put a number of students through that track, which meant you assembled a cross-campus group of people from the various medically oriented departments. That was your PhD committee, and that's how you put together such a proposal. We also had graduate students who went through the Department of Epidemiology and got an epidemiology PhD degree. So we turned out a number of master's students and a fair number of PhDs without having a program. In fact, we discovered when we finally got our PhD program approved in 1991, we discovered that we were the largest single group on campus using the special individual PhD. And that was actually on purpose because I figured if you could establish a track record that you could get the degree approved. So that's what happened in terms of the educational program. So to backtrack a little bit more, the respiratory disease research slowly died down in the 1970s. Dr. Fox retired. Marion Cooney died in the late 70s, and so that part of the research slowly wound down. And what we really wanted to do, and always had the ambition, was to have a parasitology component to pathobiology, because that's an important set of diseases which were neglected on campus. There was not much in the way of parasitology work. And we were fortunate to have a person come through by the name of Robert Rausch, who was a world-famous parasitologist, which I did not know. In fact, I discovered this when I was bringing my graduate school roommate in from the airport. I said, "We've hired Robert Rausch." He says, "Have you hired the Robert Rausch?" I says, "I don't know." I said, "This is what he is." He says, "You've hired the Robert Rausch." And he was a remarkable person. He's still doing work actively and has done a lot in parasitology. As a matter of fact, he came to dinner at our house last night. And so then, in order to deal with the complexities of getting a graduate program, pathobiology only had 3 tenured slots. I had one, and Dr. Wong had one, Dr. Hakamori had one. And during my chairmanship, which ran from 1970 to 1991, I never had a tenure slot to deal with. So the recruiting of people for tenure slots was impossible. So the way around this, which was widely assumed by the school, was to go out and get faculty members from other places. So we had faculty members at the Hutchinson. We also had graduate students down there. And in the middle of all of this, another institution was showing up in Seattle, which was the Seattle Biomedical Institute. The Seattle Biomedical was started by Ken Stewart, and he started about a two-person operation. This is back in '81. He'd been in Florida. He came to Washington and set up the so-called Issaquah Institute. The Issaquah Institute did work on parasitic diseases, so I worked with Ken Stewart for a bit. And so that organization bloomed. And so as time went by, we recruited faculty with them who worked at the Seattle Biomedical and who were part of our graduate program. And so this went on to a great extent, so we really had a very large faculty list. We had a faculty of some 6 or 7 in the 1970s, and now we have a faculty of someplace between 40 and 50 with people. And this has been an interesting program. The scientists at the Seattle Biomedical and at the Hutchinson and other institutions have been willing to fund our graduate students that were actually working with them. And so it turns out that it worked rather well. They've even managed to fund the first year's rotation experience. It's really been a remarkable partnership. So that's where we got to. So that's the history from 1960 through 1989. A slow rundown of the respiratory diseases and a great uptrack in genital disease research. So in 1991, I stepped down as chair. I was replaced by George Todaro, who was chairman for 5 years. He did not bring any research to the department and left after 5 years. I think that's about the most that should be said about it. In this time period, the chlamydia people were still busy. And it turns out that they were looking for some organisms, and they had accidentally discovered an organism in the 1960s which was not like any of the chlamydia types seen in genital disease or in respiratory disease. It was a new, difficult-to-grow organism. So they eventually got this organism out. I remember in the late 80s, the 1990s, asking Dr. Quo how many isolates he had. Well, he would say, I've got one. And maybe there's one or two more. So they eventually isolated a new species of chlamydia called chlamydia pneumoniae. And it turns out that it had a big role in respiratory disease. And what we had on hand, since we'd done the group health study, we had gotten paired sera on people with pneumonia, and we had gotten specimens from them, and they were in my freezers. So when the chlamydia pneumonia was recovered, it became possible to go back and look for antibody amongst these specimens. We knew the people had pneumonia, and so it then became possible to establish that this organism had a big role in respiratory disease. What's interesting about it is that the bug is almost ungrowable. What's been happening in the last decade in infectious diseases, we're finally getting to the bugs that couldn't be grown. And so chlamydia pneumonia was very difficult to isolate from patients. It took a long time. So it was hardly very useful as a diagnostic tool because you get an answer back maybe in 2 or 3 weeks. You could do serological work and find out what the prevalence of the agent was and how many pneumonia cases were caused by it. So it turns out it was not quite as big a cause of pneumonia as Mycoplasma pneumonia, but it filled in the gaps. When we started out, we knew that we had an agent for about 40% of pneumonia found in the general population. With Mycoplasma pneumonia, we got a little over 50. With the chlamydia, we got another 10%. So as we stand now, we still have about 20% of infectious pneumonias with no agent. There are some newer agents that have shown up. So the respiratory disease has been a long story because there are so many agents involved and the epidemiology changes. So that's what happened to the chlamydia, and that is an interesting story of people taking opportunities as they show up. So in the mycoplasmas, Mycoplasma pneumoniae was discovered in '62 when it discovered you could grow the eaten agent. It was a big cause of pneumonia. In some of our studies, it accounted for 10%, 20% of pneumonia. It was important. A lot of money flowed at it in the 70s. However, there was a distinct problem. You'd like to work with a disease that someone dies from. Mycoplasma pneumonia had the following problems. One, the pneumonia was mild, called walking pneumonia. Two, nobody died. And three, there were very few complications. And in terms of a vaccine, the worst part about it became the finding that people could get reinfected. So we did all of this stuff here. And so the national interest in Mycoplasma pneumonia went down the drain. So by the 1980s, you couldn't fund anything like pneumonia studies because it really wasn't a priority. We had treatments for it, and it turns out it didn't even matter if you failed to treat the patient. They recovered anyhow. They just recovered faster with antibiotics. So that put the mycoplasma world and my world in a fair amount of problems. But there's always, and there is a parallel with the chlamydia. In 1982, some British people isolated a tremendously slow-growing organism from the genital tract called Mycoplasma genitalium. And they got 2 isolates out. No one could ever repeat the experiments. And but everyone thought that perhaps these organisms had something to do with it. In the 1990s, with the arrival of the polymerase chain reaction, it became possible to diagnose an infection for which you could not grow the organism. So that was launched in the 1990s, particularly in Denmark by Jensen, who did a lot of this work. And so in the late 90s, we decided we would try this because Seattle is the residence of one of the largest sexually transmitted diseases centers in the entire world. We're enormously powerful. And so we had a case study, and we were able to find males who did not have gonorrhea, did not have the chlamydia, but had a urethritis. We sampled these people by the polymerase chain reaction, and we discovered, yes, indeed, they did, in fact, some of them have Mycoplasma genitalium. So the mycoplasma world has a new birth. We have a new pathogen. Now, remember, this starts from '62, and we really only get good information genitalium in the 1990s. So we now have a study going to look at the incidence and the prevalence of Mycoplasma genitalium in healthy people, sick people. We've got to find out what its host range is. And speaking of isolated organisms, we've isolated 2 so far. This adds to the 5 that are known in the rest of the world. So we've added a bit to it. And this is sort of my farewell effort is what we're going to do with Mycoplasma genitalium, because we are doing a study now to determine what treatment matters in cases of non-gonococcal urethritis with Mycoplasma genitalium. So that's a survey of where we've been.
I wonder if you could go back to the late 60s, early 70s, and that transition period between the department and the school itself. Was this a universally accepted move within the department? What were the people who constituted the Department of Preventive Medicine completely in favor of becoming a school, or was there some dissent as to being a small fish in a big pond or a big fish in a small pond? Could you try and recollect for us any of the issues that came up at that time?
Well, pathobiology started out with one faculty member, then we had two, then we had three, and by the late 1960s we had 5 core members and a couple others who were not core. We wanted to have a graduate program. And so when we went to the Division of Experimental Laboratories, there was a PhD program in preventive medicine, which we were going to use for the PhD program. And so from the point of view of the pathobiology faculty, one, they were going to get a department. They were going to be independent. And there was really no thoughts amongst the pathobiology faculty that this was a bad idea. They were all entrepreneurial sorts. They thought this might yield more money. And they were enchanted with the departmental status. And so we did not have I sat on the executive committee of the school at the time, and there were thoughts of that this was going to convert us into a school of public health, and we were going to turn out lots of people with masters of science in public health who'd have a 1.5-year program and would not reflect basic research. Well, it turns out that didn't happen. That we did manage to avoid it. From a pathobiology viewpoint, they all thought this was fine. They were going to have their own PhD program, their own master's program, and they were quite enthused. Remember, this is a time we've got plenty of money. Money is not an issue, and so funding students and all that was no difficulty. So we got through that very easily.
I wonder if you could recollect for us some of the significant personalities who were around at that time. Dr. Grayson, for one.
Yeah. Well, of the people we had, Tom Grayson founded the Department of Preventive Medicine. It was a department in the medical school that really wasn't anything when he came here. It had a few faculty members. It had no research at all. And so he came out here, got some space which had no laboratories, which he put laboratories into, and we had in the early 1960s, there were about 8 of us. We all ate lunch together. It was a very interesting time. And what Grayson's great virtue was that he was a leader, and he could lead almost anything. And he was not so involved in the trivia of administration, which was absolutely marvelous. And so his era lasted until he became a vice president. He was the first dean, and he was highly interested in infectious diseases. So that's why infectious diseases did extremely well during that time period. And aside from the fact that there was the natural loss of funding in the 1980s or in the 1970s and 80s as the respiratory business slowed down. So he was remarkable, and he was active in our department till yesterday, I think. He was responsible in a large part for seeing that all those great breakthroughs in chlamydia happened.
That was his particular field of his study in
Well,
Taiwan.
he got into the chlamydia in Taiwan. And we had a laboratory in Taiwan, Namru 2. We had an association with that. That's where he'd been. Faculty went to Namru 2. They had a laboratory and stuff. And so there was work done in Namru 2 on the trachoma. Another interesting person, much younger than Grayson, was a man named Palmer Beasley, who's now dean of a school in Texas. Palmer was very bright, very persuasive, and very quick. And he went to Taiwan, and he really did not have a great deal in mind what he was going to do, but he discovered that what we already knew, that Taiwan had a large amount of liver cancer. And so he got interested in liver cancer. And Palmer was a good friend of mine over the years and still is. And so there was a suggestion at the time that hepatitis B virus had something to do with liver cancer. So in the 1970s, we were in Boston for a meeting, went to an Italian restaurant. It had the proverbial checkered tablecloth, and Palmer laid out this gigantic study by which he was going to determine whether or not hepatitis B had anything to do with liver cancer. What he did was he selected a population of men who worked for the Taiwanese state and who had a good health care plan. That was important. And they had a very high rate of liver cancer. They were highly motivated to help. So what he did is he got 25,000 people, collected sera on them, and tested all this stuff for antibodies to hepatitis B, for hepatitis B antigen. And he got out a group of people who were antigen positive, meaning they had active virus infection, and watched them year by year. And after the first couple of years, it was already very clear that the people who were hepatitis B antigen carriers were at risk to liver cancer. The people who were not at risk. The relative risk was in the 500s. Smoking is a relative risk of about 10 or 11, and that's considered really bad. It was unbelievable. And Beasley's idea was that as if you watch the population, all those who were carriers would eventually die if they lived long enough, because the death rate increased year by year as people aged. So that was a big breakthrough and a big deal for the school. It was not recognized very well by the school how sensational this was. But it was, as Palmer said, he says, I've got the first human cancer virus. And so he did. So he was an interesting character that went through. Bob Day was dean, and Bob was interested in health services. So health services, he had been chairman of the health services division. He became dean. So the orientation became much more towards health services and the developing areas of medical care, which had a lot of pressure on them. So it was an opportunity, and this School of Public Health has been opportunistic, if nothing else. So that expanded. The pathobiology did not expand during the 1970s, except by adding faculty from the outside. And so he was dean up until sometime in the 1980s. I'd have to look at the dates. You must have the dates. I do not. So then he was replaced by Gilbert Ullman, who was very enthusiastic about everything, and he he ran a great expansion. He would go to Upper Campus to see if he could raise some money, and I'm not sure what Gil would think about with this repeat. And they would say, no, you don't need any money, because I heard from Upper Campus, we don't have to give that guy any money, he'll raise it anyhow, which he did. And so the school became more and more leveraged. So we are now in a position where new faculty, if they get any tenure at all, get half tenure. So they're under obligation to raise the other half of their salary, which leads for interesting. This is like the School of Medicine, but not like departments of microbiology, parasitology, where 100% tenure still reigns. And so this is a fair drawback for pathobiology, in that we're competing with half tenure. There's a lot of PhDs out there, so we have that advantage that if you open a job, you'll get 100 applicants. So that's a big problem.
Would you be so kind as to take us forward from Gil Ullman's deanship into the current dean?
Okay, Gil Ullman leaves to become a vice president at Michigan of Health Affairs. He does that for a couple of years, and then he becomes a professor. And he's now president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. big position, and has done all sorts of things. He was followed by Pat Wall. Pat Wall had been associate dean and was largely responsible for smoothing out some of the abrasiveness of Gil Oman. She was a politician, a consummate politician. So she stabilized the organization. So when Gil Oman left, she became a logical choice to be as dean. From the point of view of pathobiology, this is difficult because she does not have any biology background. She's very quick and all that, but you don't gain a biological background by being next to it, no more than I gain a biostatistics background by having worked with them for all these years. So that is a problem for the biologically based departments, which are more involved in basic research. And so as it stands now, pathobiology is coming to an end. And the review process is in place and is being done as we sit here. So pathobiology will probably disappear, and what will emerge in terms of teaching and research will probably be in global health.
George, wonder whether you could speak to teaching.
Okay. When I came here, I brought skills to the university which were not widely distributed. University of Minnesota was big in virology and were big in tissue culture. So I brought the tissue culture expertise here. Well, one of the things that happens, you have a laboratory and everybody else wants to do something, is they say, can I send someone down to your laboratory to learn how to do tissue culture? Well, that's a tremendous disruption because we were actually doing other stuff as well. So I decided the thing to do was to give a tissue culture course so that I could tell these people, well, we give a course. So we put together a tissue culture course in the 1960s, and it ran until 95 or 96. So that was the first course we did, and we were at that time, we had postdoctoral MDs who were getting a master's degree in preventive medicine. Many of them had interest in infectious diseases, and many of them did laboratory work in my laboratory, as a matter of fact. So I had this wonderful group of people to experiment with to actually give a course. They were very quick, very fast, and so then another field opened up, which was the study of the immune response to people with mycoplasma. I had had a fortuitous discovery in the 1960s. We were attempting to make up a test to test for antibodies to the Mycoplasma Pneumoniae. And we were having great difficulties with putting this together. So one day we decided the thing to do was to extract this organism with ether. And so we shook it up with ether. We thought that would make it work better because it would take out the stuff that was interfering. Well, what it did is it took out the antigen. And so after another time we repeated this and found out it happened. Well, I had taken lipids in graduate school. It was the worst course I had. It was taught by a guy who mumbled. And nobody got very good grades and nobody learned much. And so the ironical thing was here I was with this lipid. Well, we happened to play bridge with a couple from biochemistry. And we never discussed science. We played bridge. So he came over to our house one night, and I said, just what do you do? He says, I'm a lipid chemist. And so that helped a great deal. So we got the lipid antigen put together, and that permitted diagnosis of the disease. It was a finding which I lived off for the next 20 years. And so we were doing this sort of work. So since we were doing serological studies, the next logical course was the course which I called Antigenic Analysis to prevent those people from coming to my lab. So we gave two courses. They were given once a year. They were given to small groups, sometimes 10, sometimes 20. They had a laboratory associated with it. They had a special project they had to do, and they were lectures. So during the golden era of both serodiagnosis and viral and tissue culture, this went very well. So these courses went from the 60s through the 70s through the 80s into the 90s. So when I stepped down as chair in 91, the department changed direction. the sort of games we were playing then were stuff I didn't do. And nobody was particularly doing tissue culture, and tissue culture was simplified, and antigenic analysis was disappearing in the DNA molecule. So these courses came to an end. So Pat Wall was acting chairman of the department in '95, and so we wondered what would happen if we offered an undergraduate course in the fashionable thing called new and emerging diseases. This had a precedent. In the early 1970s, I'd been asked by the biostatistics department to give them a course in modern biology so they'd understand some of the stuff they were doing in clinical studies. So I gave this course attended by all the faculty, and it was a fair success. So after that, we taught this course every summer to the biostatistics graduate students. I claimed I was putting the bio on their statistics. And they were always a wonderful group of people, very bright, very quick. And so I taught that course last summer, as a matter of fact. But we thought maybe we should go further. And so we had just gotten AIDS in 1982, 83. And there was a whole field called New and Emerging Diseases. So we offered an undergraduate course called New and Emerging Diseases and taught it to undergraduates. And the first year was taught. There were 70 students. And then the next year I had a room that held 50, and that's what I had. Then I taught one up in Kane Hall, in one of those giant rooms. And so that course has gone on. It was taught twice a year for a while. This year we just finished teaching it this fall. And the reviews were good on the course. So we're thinking of putting it in Hogness Auditorium next fall. It could have any enrollment that you wanted. I think if you wanted to have 500, you could have it. And so it's a course that is a 2-credit course for non-majors, but it's part of the public health minor and part of the public health major that's now being done. So this is a required course. So that's been fun to do, and so I've been sort of retired since, 2000. I went to 60% time for a while, starting in 1999, and in 2003 I finally went to 0% time, but I'm still here. So I'm teaching it. It's a free ride for the school, but it's something I can do, and I find it fun. So anyhow, that's how we did the teaching business, and where that's going to go now. So is this course going to be called Global Emerging Diseases? Probably.
A number of people have spoken about the collegiality in the early days, and perhaps part of that was that it was a small department, and people knew each other. But could you recall for us, for instance, some of the lunches where everybody got together, the social occasions? You've done very well recounting the professional life. What about the social life?
Well, in the 1960s, we all had lunch together in a room which was extra space we had, and so we all gathered there every day, and a lot of stuff was actually done there at those new luncheons of people would tell people what they had discovered. The great advantage in the 1960s, one was the department was very small, and two, there was no funding problems and there were no space problems. And so that alleviates a tremendous amount. It was a growing, booming enterprise. So that was easy. As we get into the 1970s, it gets much more difficult. The departments begin to separate. Instead of knowing a lot of biostatistics people and health service people, you knew fewer and fewer. We were moved apart on floors. And so it made a large difference. In the 1960s, if you gave a party for the department, you would have everybody there. Well, everybody drank more than and all that, so it went much better. But we had a number of parties. As one of my sons said, it was about 4 at the time. He says, I looked out there and there was nothing but a sea of heads. And so Tom Grayson gave great parties. John Fox did. So there was a lot of entertainment. And Bob Day gave good parties. And Gilloman gave smaller ones. He did not go for these big ones. And they went out of fashion. You can no longer give an evening party that people come to. You could give an afternoon party that's informal that they'll come to if you feed them well enough. So as the school grew, it became more balkanized. There became competition for space, competition for money, and all this. In the golden era, we papered that all over with lots of money.
One of the comments I've heard some of your colleagues from those early days make is in regard to the luncheons. They said perhaps one of the most amazing things was the size of your sandwiches.
Well, I always had a problem maintaining weight, a problem which has disappeared. So now instead of having 2 sandwiches, lots of stuff in them, I have 1 sandwich. And we have limited stuff a great deal. It took a lot of food to keep me going when I was young, because we did a lot of stuff here. It was really energetic.
Yeah, I thought I'd give you a chance for a rejoinder there.
Yeah. Well, yes, everyone was interested in that. And the other thing we did that was interesting, when we built the school, this building was built differently than most of the buildings on campus. We actually got to design the laboratories. I worked with an architect for 6 months as we laid out the laboratory. We are now reconstructing them into more contemporary designs, but they worked very well for the sort of work that we did, because we were doing tissue culture and infectious disease work, which requires a different setup than if you're doing a molecular biology program.
Did you work with Jack Hatlin during that time?
Oh, Jack, yes, Jack and I actually published a paper, and maybe we published 2 for that matter. And Jack was always here, and Jack sort of organized everything. Jack was closely allied with Dr. Grayson, and so as laboratory things went on, he knew lots of people in the shops and all that, so we could get stuff done. And so Jack was an expediter. He had his own research, he had his own laboratory, and his own, but he had a great respect for what we did. So it was a lot of fun having him around. He's still a good friend. Well, one of the most interesting period was the period of 67 to 70. Tom Grayson had recruited 4 of the brightest postdocs we ever saw. It was an unbelievable year. They were very quick, very fast, and very socially oriented. And so we had a field day. It was the peak of all that.
Who were those?
The Palmer Beasley, Jim Gale, who you probably talked to. Roger Deedle was here at that time. Both Roger and Palmer Beasley are deans of schools of public health. And there was Ron something or other, an Italian last name. He was here. Yeah, it was a surprising group of people.
The golden era for that.
Yeah, because they had come from the CDC program, from that program of infectious diseases that they had. Tom Grayson had come from that, and so had Russ Alexander. And so, anyway, and these people went across the world. You know, they're remarkable about it. We never had graduate students quite that spectacular, but I do have a story we can record.
Oh, good.
So, are you ready?
Yeah.
Well, when we launched the graduate program, it was so small we only had a few students. So what we did is we had evening seminars in people's houses. We'd invite the faculty and the students, and they would come, and we'd have a speaker from out of town. And frequently one of my friends or somebody else's friend, and we'd have a speaker, and then we'd have a discussion, and this went very well. Well, in the very early days, one of our first graduate students, who did amazingly well later on, went to a national meeting with all the faculty there. And she came storming in my laboratory. She said, I always thought you people made out that you were much better than you really were. She says, I went to that meeting and I found out who you people really are. That was amazing.
That's a nice story.
She turned out to be very important later on.
Who was that?
Sharon Zablotnik. She actually lives in the Northwest now. She's retired. And she's teaching a new and emerging diseases courses online.
And what was her field then?
She got a PhD in epidemiology with a pathobiology emphasis. Well, what's interesting about Bill Richardson is my son lives with a woman who got a PhD in social work or social studies of women. And so she got a job in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And this is right down the road from the Kellogg Foundation, which Bill Richardson was head of. He was also on the board of Kalamazoo College. And so I got an email from Bill a couple years ago that he met Edward, my son. And what I discovered from him the last time in Kalamazoo is Bill Richardson has retired and has an office on Kalamazoo College. And so I'm sure you'll be able to get a hold of him. But he was head of the Kellogg. He had an illustrious career. He went through Hopkins, all sorts of that. And he was a dean for a short time. It's a wonderful dean. You know, anybody who got him was in great shape. I remember he came to my to my course I offer for biostat students so he could learn about infectious diseases. Yeah. Very surprising man.